In the previous segment, we discussed the Enlightenment ideas and their importance for the formation of sort of revolutionary ideas among the French and American revolutionaries. The other major development that set the stage for revolutions was the 7 Years' War, also known as the French and Indian War in American history. This was a war mainly between France and Britain, and Prussia was an ally of Britain. A war over colonial possessions in North America and also over some territorial disputes in Europe. Fighting also happened in India, so this was considered a global war, perhaps the first global war. The French lost, and their territorial losses were tremendous, as you can see from this map, which illustrates mostly the losses in North America. As a result of the Paris Treaty of 1763, Britain acquired Canada from France, Florida also went to Britain, and Louisiana went to Spain. Now Britain controlled all the territories east of the Mississippi and islands in the Caribbean. Also there was a territorial redivision between France and Britain in India. Britain emerged as the global power as a result of this war. However, this war costed both France and Britain a lot. It incurred tremendous financial burden on these two countries, and it contributed indirectly to the origin of revolutions both in Britain and in the American colonies. Now, I would like us first to turn to the American Revolution. The American colonists wanted independence from Britain, and we will look a little bit of the causes. Why did they want independence? And they issued the Declaration of Independence in 1776, which basically spelled the American colonies' demands and grievances to the British king. Eventually there was a military conflict between the American colonies and Britain won, and the American colonies won against all odds. In 1781 all military battles were won, and as a result of this war for independence, we see eventually the adoption of the Federal Constitution of 1787, which joined 13 separate colonies into a new nation. The question is, was this revolution really a revolution? How revolutionary was the American Revolution? Well, arguably, this war for independence led to a political change, but in a sense it was sort of a conservative movement because it preserved existing privileges. It preserved the existing privileges of the colonists. Rather than creating new privileges, rather than sort of establishing a new social order, it was in a sense a political revolution, or moving the power from the hands of the British Empire to the hands of the colonies, but the same old elite remained in power after the revolution. So it aimed to preserve existing privileges of the colonies rather than to create new ones. In the 17th and 18th century, the colonies enjoyed autonomy from the British Empire, and they also were used to self-governance. They had their own self-governing bodies. So eventually the colonists were so used to that autonomy that they viewed it as their own right. Participating in the British Empire also was very beneficial for the colonies because Britain was, after all, the wealthiest empire in the world at the time. It provided protection from wars, and also it provided its own markets. The British Empire had established this mercantilist system where also its colonies were supposed to trade with the mother colony or the mother country, Britain itself. But the American colonies had ready access to markets, which was huge. So none of the American colonies really thought about breaking away from Britain up until the mid of 18th century. Now, there were real differences between Englishmen in England and American colonies. So, arguably there were some social distinctions in the North American colonies. There was a small class of elite of landowners, wealthy landowners like the Adams and the Washingtons and the Jeffersons. But, there was no hereditary aristocracy the way we had a hereditary aristocracy and entrenched aristocracy in Britain and the whole of Europe. Also, there was no single church. The first settlers in the American colonies, they were all religious dissenters. They wanted to practice freely their religion. They believed in the right of freedom of religious expression. Also, there was plenty of land, and there were small farm owners in these American colonies. Now, there was the perception that there was plenty of land. That's mostly because of the displacement of the indigenous population, of the Amerindians, of the Native Americans. They were displaced, they were pushed westward. Also, all free men enjoyed the same status in front of the law. Of course, slaves and women were excluded from these privileges. So, this was the main difference between the American colonies and Britain. There was less poverty, there were more economic opportunities, and there were very few social distinctions. So it was more sort of egalitarian society in the American colonies than in Britain. The American Revolution did not start because of social tensions as it happened in France. It started because Britain decided all of a sudden to extract more revenue from the colonies and also to sort of restrict the colonies' autonomies. Remember, the colonies were kind of used to self-governing. They barely paid any dues to the British. But all of a sudden, after the 7 Years' War, Britain drained its treasury, so it needed more revenue to pay its debt. And in the 1760s, the British government began to look to the American colonies to raise money. So Britain imposed a series of taxes on, the so-called acts, the Stamp Act, and so on the American colonies, and that was without the consent of the colonists. So the Americans, they decided that they wouldn't pay more taxes, because they said, well, we are not represented in the British Parliament. The colonies felt that their economic interests were threatened, also that their self-governance was threatened, and their very identity as Englishmen was threatened. By that time, the American colonies had already embraced the ideas of the Enlightenment, the ideas of popular sovereignty, of natural rights, and the consent of the governed. So, the American colonies entered into a war with Britain. Eventually, all battles were won by the eventually the American revolutionaries won with the help of the French, and eventually we have the formation of a new independent state. Now, what was revolutionary about the American War of Independence was the very society that had emerged before the revolution even happened. That society, we can say, was revolutionary. The revolution itself did not change the social order. Political power remained in the hands of the same existing elite. property rights for the right to vote or property requirements for the right to vote were lowered, but again, women and slaves were still excluded. Land was not seized from its owners. Land remained in the hands of the same owners. Slavery was gradually abolished in the north, but it remained in the south. It persisted and remained entrenched institution in the south. And eventually, the United States will go into a civil war over the issue of slavery. And that finally would be resolved, and slavery eventually would be abolished in the second half of the 19th century. Now, arguably, the United States would become one of the most democratic countries in the world, but that was not as a result of the revolution. It actually happened gradually through reform within the existing political system. It didn't really happen through a revolution.